Hey everyone, welcome to episode 80 of the Miami Tech Pod. I'm Cesar. I'm joined by Brian Breslin and Maria Derchi, and our special guest this week, Greg Galant, the CEO and founder of Muck. You may have heard Muck is a software for the public relations industry and all sorts of really cool features for reaching out to journalists and creating media reports and all of that. Greg, welcome to the Miami Tech Pod, man. It's great to have you.
Hey, thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, definitely. I really think, just personally, because I'm in the industry and I've done public relations for tech companies. I really think this is such a cool product. But can you start by telling listeners what is Muck? Did I get it right? Was there is there more to the software that people should know?
Muck's a PR software company. So we're basically this SaaS platform that public relations departments use and PR agencies to do everything they need to do for their jobs. So it has a search engine. They can find the right journalists to talk to. So if you're like, hey, we're doing Miami Tech Week, let's look up which journalists have written about Miami Tech Week in past or companies raising money in Miami. In our search engine, you could find them, and it's got a workflow to find the right journalists, podcasters too, newsletter writers, anyone who's kind of an earned media influencer. You can search right in the platform. It's got the workflow to add them to a media list, send them pitches, follow up with them, track those relationships. In addition, it has media monitoring, so you can know anytime you're mentioned in the press, and reporting, so you can build a report and show the CEO or your client, hey, here's how much press we got, here's the effectiveness of that PR.
I feel like that's super useful. I mean, we know public relations is this massive industry, and before Muck and maybe some of your competitors, press lists lived in Excel sheets, right? That was essentially how people built databases, and if one person left a company, it may leave with them, and there wasn't necessarily a organized way. Do I have that right?
100%. Yeah. I mean, when we started the company, it was like the industry was basically these companies that used to send out books, like physical phone books of all the journalists, and they just kind of digitized that, but it was still this very flat database. And then everyone was keeping an Excel, like you said. And the problem is not only if your own employee leaves, where's that Excel sheet, but even if you're the one working at a company, that the journalists you have on that Excel sheet are always changing jobs. So every time you go to send out a new press release, well, who got a new job in the last week? Or even if they stayed at the same media outlet, maybe they changed beats and now there's someone new at that beat. So if you keep those media lists in Muck, then they automatically update when all your contacts change jobs and switch around. So you don't have to do all that manual work. And then you can also collaborate with your team.
So Greg, how big is the team at Muck?
Yeah, we're well over 200 people now, and we're growing quickly. So we started the year at just 150 people. We're already, we should be ending the year at about 250 people.
That's amazing.
And you had some big news recently. So previous to, you just raised a $180 million Series A. You had bootstrapped it until this point. Can you share a little bit more about the founding story and kind of how has it evolved over the years?
Yeah. Why'd you start the company, Greg?
Well, it all came out of podcasting. So I'd started a podcast back in 2005. But before podcasting was it was just barely a word. People were still calling it RSS feeds with enclosures back then, which not as sexy. But started this podcast.
It doesn't roll off the tip of the tongue like podcast, right?
It was a good rebrand. A lot of people don't even know now. It came out of it was right when the iPod had come out.
Yeah.
And
totally.
So it was a play on the iPod. And a lot of people now are like, well, what's the iPod? They're just so used to the iPhone. But I kind of saw in those early days the potential, and it was right when I graduated college. So I went to college in Atlanta, so I kept getting stuck in Atlanta traffic and hated Atlanta radio. And the iPod had just come out. I was like, there's got to be a way to get spoken word content onto this thing. So I looked into it and I just decided to start a podcast interviewing entrepreneurs about how they got started. That's of course a very common format today, but back in 2005, no one had done it before. So I started one up. I'd interviewed all these people who went on to greatness. I had Reid Hoffman on back when LinkedIn was a 50-employee company. First podcast he was ever on. The founder of Yelp, the founder of Vanguard Group. All these people were like, when I had them on, they were like, well, what's this podcast thing? They'd never been on one before. And one of the people I had on my podcast was Ev Williams, who is working on this really hot startup called Odeo. There was a podcast directory. So I stayed in touch with Ev because we were both in kind of that early podcasting scene. Odeo didn't work out. So I watched Ev pivot to a little side project called Twitter. And that led me to sign up for Twitter way early. I got just @Gregory on Twitter by being the first Gregory on there.
There you go.
And then watching that kind of early
Quite the
social media
flex.
world.
Yeah. By the way, Greg, has anyone tried to buy @Gregory from you? I'm always curious by the people that have @first names.
Yeah, many have. Actually, interestingly, I also have @Gregory on Instagram. And many more people, the Instagram one, I've gotten many more offers than the Twitter one. Funny enough, too, not only are there offers to buy it, but I get a lot of like teenagers on Instagram just asking me if I'll give it to them. It's like, oh, hey, could I bet my name's Gregory too? Could I get that handle?
Yeah, shoot your shot, right? Let me ask something worth probably tens of millions of dollars for free.
That's my retirement plan right there.
There you go. You need to encourage a friend to start a hot company called Gregory, and then like get him some investors and let it go big, and then you sell it. I feel like that's the ultimate chess game.
I mean, there was
I'm actually reading on it because there's a chain of coffee shops in the Northeast called Gregory's Coffee.
You've thought of this. You've thought of this.
Yes, I'm hoping they go global and then they really want that handle.
Yeah. So I mean, we go ahead, Brian. What was that?
No, I was saying, Greg, I think that's a missed opportunity. You could have been a seed investor in Gregory's Coffee. Spread your bets against your naming rights as much as you could.
Yeah, I'm going to start Gregory Ventures and just invest in enterprise.
Only Gregory-related businesses. Yeah.
I think this is good. I hope you're all in as LPs.
There you go.
Naturally. I mean, this is advanced deal flow that we're getting a tip on here, right?
Yeah, totally. All right. So you stayed in touch with Ev. He was doing a side project called Twitter. And you're like, what? Let me keep going on this podcast thing. Ev just didn't know what he was doing, but I do.
Well, basically, I was in that early Twitter world, and then I saw there was like a opportunity. There was no way to discover like who's worth following back then. Right. I don't know if there is now, but we thought we could crowdsource that by letting people vote with a tweet, which is now a very common thing. You're asked vote online, share this on Twitter, share this on Facebook. No one had done that back in this was now 2008, and so we had the idea to launch. Figured tweets are short, so we call it the Shorty Awards for the best of social media. Launched that in 2008, and it was really a joke. I mean, we built this website in like 2 weekends and didn't even have a venue booked. We're like, let's see what happens. Put up the website. Within 24 hours, Shorty Awards became the top trending term on Twitter. And then very quickly, we got covered in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, BBC. It just became kind of a sensation. So I'd never had as intense time in my life where we just had to drop everything and figure out how to put on an award show in basically 2 months from like when this thing went viral to like having a ceremony, people flown in from around the world, sponsors, venue, all that.
Where was it? Where was the first Shorty Awards?
We did it at Galapagos Art Space in Dumbo, Brooklyn, cool. Which is now a very hot neighborhood in Brooklyn. Like there's people taking selfies all over the place. But back in, this was 2009 when we did early 2009 when we did the first Shorty Awards, like no one, we actually had an office in Dumbo at the time, but like no one wanted to come to Brooklyn back then.
Right. People are like, where are we?
A lot of people are asking themselves that. And then it was out of seeing how much press we got at the Shorty Awards and how many journalists came, that led to the initial idea for Muckrack, which was like, let's just make it easy to find all the journalists on social media in one place. We came with a name. We took the term muckraker, which is an old term from like, I think the 1920s to refer to journalists that I think it was Teddy Roosevelt who coined it, and that, or at least popularized it. And it was initially kind of a derogatory term for journalists, like, hey, you're digging through the muck to find dirt on people. But then journalists came to view it as a compliment over the years, because it's like, hey, you're not just regurgitating some press release, you're actually doing your job. And we had this idea that it's like a news rack or a magazine rack. You could see all the media in one place. So $8 later on GoDaddy, which is our full branding budget, we bought muckrack.com, which no one had had, put up that site, became very popular with journalists. We had over 10,000 journalists request to get listed on Muckrack in that first year.
Whoa.
And
like,
then
hold on, stop right there. Like 10,000 journalists in year one.
Yeah.
What was that? Was it just because of the virality of the Shorty Awards and you building off of that, or did you have a big following? Were there like, did you create kind of a viral loop within the journalists saying, hey, I'm on Muckrack, or like how, I mean, that's explosive growth for year one.
Yeah, it was a combination of factors. A big part of it was like that viral loop of like knowing, and word of mouth, like knowing like this is a place to see and be seen. We kind of traded on some of our credibility from the Shorty Awards. We got PR for it. We got, I think it was Peter Kafka who covered it first in All Things D. So it got attention that way. And then everybody would just link to it, because back then it was so hard to find anyone on social media. So like for a while, like the New York Times intranet linked to the Muckrack page for New York Times is like, you want to see what your colleagues are up to on social media, check out muckrack.com/NYT. So it was just like first to fill this like really, really big need. And back when we were getting started, with both Muckrack and the Shorties, we launched them like within a couple of weeks of having the idea. So it was like just capturing that zeitgeist for like, what do people need right now? And then building it very quickly and getting it out there and kind of solving that problem. And then once people know that's the place to go, along with good design and fast loading website and all the basics, that kind of built on itself.
Greg, I'm kind of curious, like, what are your thoughts on sort of like the shifting landscape around like traditional journalism versus like all the citizen journalism we're seeing now, like in real time on Twitter, right? Like, I mean, it's kind of wild watching all this FTX craziness, and like the people leading the coverage is a random Twitter account called Autism Capital, right? Like, that's not a traditional journalist by any means. I mean, I don't know who's behind it, but like, how do you think this plays into sort of what you guys are doing and all that?
That's a bit of a departure from the paper of record.
Right. Yeah.
100%. Yeah. I think it's a healthy tension that there's both a role for the traditional press where there are a lot of stories out there where you need more resources and ways to dig into it. And then also, there are a lot of times where you need the outsider and a new perspective to break into something, or sometimes where there's just an expert who has knowledge of something who can share it on social. And I think there's like a good interplay that happens between them too, because you can have that, maybe a Twitter account getting out ahead and reporting something that they know really well, but then leaving it to kind of the more mainstream press to verify that, and then to cite that, re-report it, and share it with wider groups of people who wouldn't otherwise find that account.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, we've seen sort of what also happens when citizen journalism goes wrong too. Like, remember the Boston Marathon bombing, when Reddit took it upon themselves to like hunt down a suspect, and it turns out it was the wrong one and like ruined a guy's life, So but it is fascinating to see sort of the social dynamics going on and the market dynamics of, trained journalism versus untrained and all that.
Yeah, and I think in a way, I mean, it kind of calls back to if you read about like the early history of newspapers in this country, it was, people like Ben Franklin and his brother, like it's like anyone could spin up a printing press and start writing what they want. And a lot of people wrote pretty insane stuff. And then over the years, you kind of knew which ones to trust and which ones not to trust. So I feel like there have been many transitions in media before where like during the transitional period, a lot of really messy stuff can happen. And I feel like we're in another one of those transitional periods. I'm generally an optimist, but I feel like, it's going to might be messy for a while, but then eventually, we'll settle down where everyone kind of understands how the new media landscape looks. But in the meantime, though, a lot of, our value, it's been interesting for us having to evolve our product over the last 10 years, because when we started Muckrack 10 years ago, and there's already blogs and forms of citizen journalism and Reddit, like with that example you cited, but the media universe was a lot more defined, and many journalists weren't changing jobs as much back then. You didn't yet have Substacks and newsletters, and you didn't have as influential accounts on social media, like with the Twitter account that you cited. So when we launched Muckrack, it was initially more about like, hey, you need to be in the New York Times. We're going to help you find the right journalists at the New York Times to pitch. And now it's a bit more like, well, you might not even know what media outlet you need to be in, because it might be there's some Substack that was started 3 months ago that's going to be super influential for the audience you want to reach, and you don't even know it exists. So we've had to keep evolving our product to kind of keep up with that dynamic of the discovery needs of our customers.
So, Greg, you mentioned you started Muckrack 10 years ago, was it?
Yeah, it depends how you count it. We launched as the free site for journalists 13 years ago. And then it was about 10 years ago that we pivoted, where we kept it all free for journalists, and it's still free. Lots of journalists use it to maintain their online profiles. But it was about 10 years ago that we added the SaaS component of it, where it's a SaaS platform for public relations departments.
And so you bootstrapped it for a long time. What made you decide to finally take outside capital, and what is your plans for the outside capital? What are you going to do with it?
Yeah, so we bootstrapped it, as you said, for over a decade, and just grew it profitably, the kind of old-fashioned way of running a business. And I think we kind of hit this tipping point this year where like growth really not only kept up as we got bigger. Usually the law of large numbers causes growth to slow down, but it actually accelerated. It's like, okay, we're growing really fast, we're at a big scale. And then we just saw that there's still a huge opportunity ahead of us, that it's a really big market that we're in. I mean, billions and billions of dollars are spent on PR every year. And, the media is not getting any easier to deal with. It's only, with all the trends we talked about, there's only more challenges for companies out there with earned media that software can solve. So we saw a really big opportunity ahead of us. At the same time, we don't want to lose what's kind of made Muckrack special, but we saw that we were in a position where we could bring on a minority investment and just have a little more firepower to be able to go after the market opportunity ahead of us, stay focused on growth. And so, we're really looking to use the money to just keep growing fast. We've been growing, throughout the years, we've grown anywhere from 50% to 75% year over year. So we want to keep up fast growth. We want to expand internationally. We don't have any acquisitions planned. That's not part of the investment thesis, but now we have the wherewithal where if we see a good opportunity to make an acquisition, we have plenty of wherewithal for that. So yeah, it's really just to set us up. And also, we wanted to kind of signal to the market that like even though we're 10 years in, we're not done. We're kind of just getting going, and that's what our overnight to Series A experience was.
Yeah, Greg, I feel like the company in a way is like counter cyclical in that you have a lot of early stage companies or venture backed companies right now that are leaning heavily on generating PR and earned media more than paid marketing, right? And do you see that as you have marketing departments around the industry reduce like paid spend, that the need for tools for PR professionals within companies is like as important as ever?
100%. I think PR, or the fancy term for it now, earned media. The media you're not paying for. I mean, it's the best friend of anyone who needs to bootstrap, or just anyone who needs to be capital efficient, because you're not paying for it. And if you can find those opportunities to get press, it's like not only are you not paying for it, but it's actually more credible because people know, like, hey, you have someone on your podcast because they're interesting. People want to listen. If you had somebody on your podcast just because they paid you a bunch of cash, nobody wants to listen to that. I'm sure we all use even in the podcasting world, use the skip 30 seconds ahead to get through the ad if we're not driving or doing something dangerous where we can't hit that button. It's really powerful. It's really credible. Even in good times, like if you look at Bill Gurley has a lot of great tweets about who's one of the investors in Airbnb, about how Airbnb grew super efficiently through PR, and they actually, even if they wanted to spend all the money in the world on paid advertising, it would have been hard because when Airbnb was starting, like nobody was Googling like, how do I stay in a stranger's house? Like what keywords would you know how to buy? It was a new concept. So what you had to do is get press and like tell people like, hey, there's this new way to travel. Look at this cool startup that's doing it. So I mean, press, in any market, I think is really, really important. But I think in a way, it's got this kind of, it's not totally recession proof, but it's got an element of that, because it's like in good times, everyone ramps up their marketing spend and spends hundreds of millions of dollars in marketing. And the second they're like not sure they're going to hit their numbers, like, oh shit, we got to cut that marketing budget from 100 million and we'll cut it to 5 million. Whereas in PR, when times are good, they're not spending a whole lot of money on it, but they're getting a great return on it. And when times are bad, if you're laying off 10% of your workforce, you have a PR crisis. Like you need to explain to the public, like, what are you doing? So you're probably not going to cut the PR department. You're probably going to lean on the PR department more than ever to help guide you through how you tell the story.
To be clear, Cesar does do that search you were talking about of how to stay in a stranger's house on a regular basis.
No, but it's a super interesting point, right? Like if you're a completely disruptive company, I never thought of that. Like, how do you actually market something you created that's never existed before, right? Against search, which is like people don't know to search for your product. It's a really interesting conundrum. But all right, Greg, I have like a super important question for you. You think Elon's going to pull it off? Is Twitter over?
Ooh, this has been, well, I'm scared to answer in any way because it's a Friday and everything might change by Monday.
We need to provide some transparency here for everyone. This is November 18th that we're recording this on a Friday. This will air on Monday, but don't hold Greg accountable for if he predicts something that gets it wildly wrong, because this is a volatile market, the Twitter world right now.
Well, here's the thing. Since I registered at Gregory, Twitter's had, I think, like 6 different CEOs. It's gone public, had highs and lows. And, a lot of people forget this now, but like for the first several years, they had tons of outages. Actually,
fail whales.
Yeah, I was about to bring up the fail whale. And actually, at the very first Shorty Awards, we flew Ying Lu, the designer of the fail whale, in because she won our design category. We flew her in from Australia. It was her first trip to America. And for anyone that doesn't know, this was Google fail whale. It'll come up in Google Images, whatever. But Twitter was going, the backstory of that is that they were having a lot of server problems back in the early days. So Biz Stone, one of the other co-founders, went on iStock Photo and licensed the image of the fail whale, or it was called Lifting a Dreamer, this illustration of a whale being lifted up by birds for $10, and stuck it on their like overloaded page. So that way, at least when the site got overloaded, people would see something nice rather than, at the time it used, all the error pages before that were very, very crude. And then they had so many server problems because they were growing super fast, and they didn't really architect the site for the scale that they ended up achieving. It's like a year where they were like down half the time for the most part, and that image of the whale being lifted up by birds got dubbed the fail whale because it was Twitter failing, and it was like a serious meme for anyone who was on Twitter back in the day. So, in a way, I mean, so far it seems like the site's operating well, but if it did start going down, it would just be harkening back to an earlier age of Twitter. It wouldn't even be the first time that it happens. So I don't know. I'm optimistic about Twitter. I think it's like just a resilient platform, and I've been around long enough to see it go through so many challenges and still come out ahead, sometimes despite itself, that I wouldn't be fast to bet against Twitter. But then again, I hope it's still up on Monday, because I don't want to look that'd be embarrassing if it weren't.
Do you think the up and coming sort of open source competitors like Mastodon and stuff like that are gonna actually make a dent or actually survive, with this sort of flee Twitter movement? Or do you think it's just going to be, they're going to go the way of like MySpace or something like that, which weirdly MySpace is still around, but yeah.
It's going to be delete Uber, where it's like a fad. That's what I think it's going to be. There's going to be people that are like, I'm never going to be on Twitter. Like, I hate Elon Musk. And then that will represent like a tiny percentage of the daily active users. And then
I mean, that's an interesting topic actually to bring up, Cesar, because like there was a time period when like the internet mobs sort of would like cancel whatever it was, and you thought that this was a much bigger issue all overall, right? But then it's like now the playbook is just sort of like wait it out, and all these people forget in a week what they were so mad about, and they move on to the next thing they're outraged about. And so like I think the same thing is going to happen with Twitter, that all these people who were like, oh, F Elon Musk, blah blah blah, we're canceling our Twitter accounts, like, okay, but you're on Twitter talking about
exactly.
it.
Exactly. They're all expressing their outrage by tweeting.
Right. Generating more page views, right? Because at the end of the day, that's all that like the ads team cares about, right? More views, more inventory to market against.
Yeah. My thought on this though is like, we will for sure know the minimum amount of engineering resources that it takes to run the company pretty soon. But like, there are a lot of companies that have like millions and millions and millions of users that are extremely lean in their tech department.
Like WhatsApp was a perfect example, no?
Yeah. When Facebook acquired Instagram, it was like less than 50 employees, right? Like stuff like that. And sure, 15. They're not 15. There you go. Like,
yeah, we gave Instagram actually won a Shorty Award before Facebook bought them, and we were trying to get the founders out for it, and they're like, oh, at the last minute, they only had one non-engineer back then, and she was like, oh, they're kind of busy this week, we'll record it. So instead they like recorded it, their acceptance speech, like on an iPhone in like the alley next to their office in San Francisco. And then like later that week, it was announced that Facebook bought them for $1 billion. And I'm like, oh, I could see why they were too busy to fly to Brooklyn to
pass
this award.
Wow.
And they showed up on a private jet the next week.
But like, what, Greg, you run a multi-100 person organization. I mean, like, and you all have grown quickly. You're probably not the size of Twitter, but how lean do you think they can go? Do you think that Elon could run it with 500 employees?
That's a good question. I think it depends on the business model. I mean, well, there's a couple pieces of that. It's like I'm sure the tech could be run by 500 people, and of all those employees they had, might have only been 500 of them were engineers who are working on like platform stability. I think the bigger challenge is if you want brand advertising, which was one of Twitter's big revenue streams, like that just takes a lot of people because people don't programmatically buy brand ads. You need to show up at the Cannes Lion Ad Festival and wine and dine them, and have people to go into Procter and Gamble and tell them what's coming down the pipeline and go talk to all the agencies. It's a person intensive business if you have kind of a Salesforce driven, or need a sales team to get your revenue. Contrast that with like Craigslist, which I think is still only, I don't know, a couple hundred employees, but they don't do brand ads. The only way they get money is that you're typing in your credit card and buying that job ad on there for $30 or whatever. So it can be a lot more capital efficient, and Craigslist is purposely not maximizing their revenue. Craig Newmark just doesn't care. He's like on making hundreds of millions a year and trying to donate it all.
He's probably like the quietest billionaire that we don't ever hear about, right? Because like I've heard that they do over 500 million a year in revenue, and like he owns the entirety of it.
It's going to be the last website off the internet. It's like if this at the end of the world, the last website standing will be Craigslist.com.
Mad Max, they all use Craigslist to do transactions. So Greg, tell us like what's Miami been like since you moved here? Like what surprised you?
Yeah, please share the how you ended up here, because for some context, I was looking back at going back to Twitter. We had originally connected on Twitter. This was January 2021. You were like, "Hey, I'm here for the next 2 weeks. Do you want to meet outdoors?" Because obviously it was still very height of the pandemic. Do you want to meet outdoors for a drink or coffee? And I was like, "Sure, let's do it." And then you originally were like, "Oh, I rented a car. I bought a car. I'm driving through the U.S. I'm only here for a little bit and wanted to meet some people." How did that? You now live here, so would love kind of. And I know I've made fun of you after you kept kind of pushing your date that you were leaving, and so would love for kind of you take our listeners through that story.
Sure thing. So I'd spent basically my whole life after college in New York City, and I spent all of 2020 in New York City throughout kind of the height of the pandemic, and lived through all that craziness. And in the summer 2020, actually, it was one of the most fun summers I had in New York because I'm into cycling and I could cycle in Central Park. No tourists were there, and get outside and meet people outdoors. But then as winter was approaching, I was like, well, I don't know. I just have I had lived alone in a one bedroom. I'm like, this, like all of New York City life is predicated on the idea that you don't spend any time in your apartment. So I was like, okay. And I never owned a car, of course, as most New Yorkers don't. So I hatched this plan. I was sick of my apartment. So I gave up my apartment. I stuck all my stuff in storage, and I bought a Tesla, which at the time an unusual thing to do in New York. They weren't that popular there yet. And my plan was to spend like 4 or 5 months just driving throughout the country and then seeing where I land. So I get to, and my idea was, of course, to go to warmer places since you could only meet outside, as you point out. And I brought my bike with me, so I wanted to be able to cycle, which is amazing. Pandemic. I was into cycling even before the pandemic, but it was the perfect pandemic sport. And so I get to Miami.
Was Miami the first stop?
Yeah, Miami was the first stop. I stopped at Asheville for like a week, but Miami was like the first real stop of having somewhere to like remote work for a longer amount of time. And when I was going down to Miami, like I didn't, making this plan November, December 2020, like Miami hadn't yet had the whole tech buzz around it. So I'm planning this out. I'm like, I don't know anyone in Miami. And I'd been to Miami before for like weekends and stayed at hotels on Collins Avenue, but Miami in my head was a place you could only spend at max 3 days, and then be really fun on the beach, and then okay, you've had enough, back to real life. So I'm making this plan. I was almost not going to come to Miami. I'm like, I'm not sure I could do 2 weeks in Miami, but I'm like, yeah, it's the warmest place. I'll just go there. So get down to Miami. And then that's like right when Miami had that huge explosion of tech people. So, I met you, Maria. The mayor invited me to City Hall for the Cafecito talk, all just by Twitter DM. It was pretty wild. And then all these friends of mine from both New York and San Francisco were also coming down at the same point, which I didn't know they would. So I was literally like just running into people I knew on the street, just because there were so many New Yorkers coming down, and all of us New Yorkers were like hanging out in such concentrated areas. So on one hand, I'm having a much better time than I thought I would. But nevertheless, I'd already put down money on a Airbnb in Austin, which is going to be my next stop in February. So I'm telling everybody like yourself, like, hey, it was great hanging out here, but I'm going to go. I even did a outdoor going away dinner with a handful of friends of mine. I was not sure I was going to go to Austin. And then I wake up one morning, I look at the news, and I see they're predicting a snowstorm in Austin. Like, all right, well, I'll stay another week in Miami. So by this time, my Airbnb was up, so I just booked the Residence Inn in South Beach. So I'm at the Residence Inn for a week, and then that's when that huge blizzard hit Texas and like knocked out the power for what turned out to be a month. So I kept extending, not knowing how bad it'd be in Texas, like a week at a time, and that's where people like yourself, Maria, and other friends of mine, like, every week I'd see them and they'd be like, what are you doing here? I'm like, I decided to stay for one more week. And then I'd appear the next week and they'd be like, I thought you left. I'm like, yeah, one more week. And then after like a month of being at the Residence Inn, I'm thinking like, you know what? It's pretty nice in Miami. Like, why am I like stressing myself to get out? So I started looking at real estate. Next thing you knew, bought a condo and became a Florida man.
I love
There
it.
you
And
go.
you're pretty active in the cycling group here with other Miami Techers, right?
Yeah, that's right. I think it was you who originally introduced me to them. So thank you for
I was
that.
like,
Even
here's
though
his group. I don't cycle and I can never cycle, but
well,
feel
that can
free.
still be changed. But yeah, there was this great Miami cycling group where it was like meeting every Saturday, and again, I was running into people I knew from New York who would also come down and cycle. I met a lot of both native Miamiites through it in the Miami tech scene, and also a lot of new transplants like me. So it was a great way to meet new folks down here in Miami, and also just such a treat as someone who used to live in New York to be able to go cycling in January.
What an amazing story. Awesome company. This is the your time to plug whatever you want part of the show. So feel free, to let listeners know how they can learn more about Muckrack, or, it's not hard to follow at Gregory. I mean, I feel like you just have to because of the cachet of it. But, I see you still interview a bunch of like amazing entrepreneurs and investors. I saw your Mark Cuban, Chad and all of that. So, but yeah, take it away and we'll wrap after that.
Great. Well, I think you did most of my plugging for me already, but yeah, if you know anyone who's in public relations, just go to muckrack.com, muckrack.com. Or if you know any journalists or podcasters, people who want to have profiles on there, you can go there too and click on the For Journalists part to see all that. We also have a lot of free resources for anyone. We have an academy where you can take online courses on how to do PR, media relations, social media. So if you're like, hey, I need PR for my company, but I can't yet afford to hire someone, or I just want to learn how the whole thing works, we have lots of great free resources for that. We have online webinars with journalists, a lot of other great stuff in that regard. If anyone wants to listen to my podcast, it's on a little bit of a hiatus, but I have a lot of new interviews I did last year on there. It's just Venture Voice. You can find it on any podcasting platform. And then, yeah, if you want to see what I'm up to, just @Gregory on Twitter or Instagram. And unfortunately, I don't have as cool of username on LinkedIn, but you can find me there too.
I think that's okay. I don't think anything cool actually happens on LinkedIn, so you don't have to worry about that. And also, you're not looking for a job, so who cares, right?
Gotta keep my resume fresh. You never know. But I think Muck Rack's gonna probably keep me busy for another decade, so probably be all right.
Awesome, Greg. Well, thanks for joining the show, and we'll talk soon. You're welcome back anytime, man.
Awesome. Thank you all for having me on. It's been a blast. I think this is my first Miami focused podcast, so I'm honored to come on.